It is kind of warm.
No, it feels good. No.
Yeah, I say it's cool on this side.
Don't do that.
Coming out.
Because as soon as they turn it on, it'll be an icebox. There is no happy medium in this building.
Good. All right, good morning. It is 10:30 a.m. Friday, March 29th. This is the Beach Preservation Ad Hoc Committee meeting. I'd like to call the meeting to order and acknowledge that the press and public were duly notified of the meeting in accordance with the Freedom of Information Act. So today's discussion, we have Mayor O'Neill from Sullivan's Island. Thank you for joining us. Andy Binky, who is the town administrator, will be joining us shortly. Nicole Elko, who has been with us before, is on Zoom, which is Sullivan's Island coastal engineer. Mr. Trainum's here with us. Needs no introduction. Fortunately or unfortunately, I don't know. Well, it just is what it is. Yeah. So Pat, thank you for taking the time and doing that. We put this group together. This is, I think, our 6th or 7th meeting. Some council folks, some residents, Stephen, staff, obviously. Once life started happening at Breach Inlet over the last few months, we just felt the need to pull a group together, comprised of residents and council members, just to see what we needed to do maybe different going forward from a project standpoint, a funding standpoint, a proactive standpoint. So not too many high hills to climb, but it's been great so far. We've talked to folks from Dare County, North Carolina. We've had Stephen here a couple of times. We had Nicole here last week or the week before. So it's been a good process so far. We're probably, hopefully, more than halfway through our meeting time. We'll start getting to action, hopefully at some point. We've been doing a lot of listening and questioning. We've got the Army Corps coming in, not next Friday, but the next, to have a conversation with them, just as an alternative to see what that would look like. So this committee wanted to have Sullivan's Island here and Nicole just to see if there were collaboration opportunities, just to hear your view of, kind of how you manage the beach and what you're looking to do in the short and long term as we're trying to define. Andy Binky, thank you for joining us.
Sorry, I'm late.
That's all right. You had a long way to come. Andy is a town administrator for a long time at Sullivan's Island, and if Pat will release the handcuffs, he's going to retire this summer. So we'll see what happens. But Andy, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
So Douglas or Stephen, any other commentary before we kind of let them?
No, I think that's it. I mean, we have talked, as the mayor said, about ideas that the city may want to start looking at in the inlet. I think we want to do that in collaboration with Sullivan's Island. Questions have come up about your willingness to participate, be it financially or just collaborate on solutions there and kind of get you all worked into our workflow sooner rather than later. It's kind of our perspective.
I appreciate that. I think things always work better that way. And we've always had a good partnership with IOP, and it's a growing partnership. So thank you.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So, Stephen, anything else to add to kind of what we're looking for, first part of this conversation?
Yeah, I don't know of anything specific other than I do know, discussions have been had on the inlet and the dynamics of the inlet and whether the inlet's, clogging up or there's been some kind of unnatural change in the inlet that may be impacting Isle of Palms Beach, but also impacting Sullivan's Beach. And also the idea of, well, what about any particular project within the inlet, how that might impact Isle of Palms, but also how it impacts on Sullivan's Island. So I don't think at this point any project is moving forward. There's not been any kind of recommendation, but I'm just kind of considering that whatever's done on one island has the potential to impact another. We want to be completely upfront and open about those discussions. So.
Can I ask for one more thing?
Sure.
I'd be interested to hear too, with the Army Corps project, I think Sullivan's is going to get a couple 100,000 cubic yards of sand as well. What you're doing to either prepare for that, what your plans are with that sand, where it might go. I don't know if that has or doesn't have an impact on IOP, but anything that has to do with that, immediate plan would be helpful too.
So we're looking to receive 175,000 cubic yards. I think that's based on Nicole and Stephen's calculation of what would fit into our area that's where it's needed, which is basically from maybe about station 30 to 32. The general idea is that in the inlet zone, whatever's put there probably wouldn't stay very long right now, I think is the way we understand it. And so we're under contract with Coastal Science to hopefully we'll be able to contract with the dredge company to spread that sand that's deposited there. I guess our options are anywhere from letting it naturally disperse along the beach or to sort of spread it out ourselves. So that's kind of the general idea. We'll probably not really build a beach, as I understand it, but spread the sand out so that it'll help those impacted areas. And probably about 5,000 cubic yards will, some sand will go in Breach Inlet, but we'll also dry store some of it for residents that have an erosion issue on the western end of Sullivan's Island. And council hasn't worked out the details, but more than likely it'll be made available for them to come get it and place in their area on the western end.
In fact, we've got one, or is it two that are doing it right now?
Right now, two underway right now, that's right.
That are placing sand or that are are signing up
They're
for sand?
doing it themselves.
Yeah, from an inland pit, not from anything related to the core.
Okay.
And I'll just add to that, much like Isle of Palm, Sullivan's is kind of at the will of the Corps on where the sand is initially being placed. So the Corps has identified where they're going to place the sand on Sullivan's Beach, and they're going to work to move that sand up into a dune, and in some areas, a dry sand beach, much like Isle of Palm's is planning on doing. So trying to build a dune in areas that don't have any dune right now, or in some areas cover portions of the rock seawall. So we're really trying to shift as much sand up the profile as possible there, recognizing that along that channel, they're going to have a really hard time trying to hold that in place long term. It's just not where sand wants to be. I would say that anything that's occurring on the Sullivan's side of the center line of the channel really shouldn't have much of an impact on Isle of Palms at all. If it's up on the beach system, it's really not going to change the dynamics that are occurring on, your side of the shoreline.
And I would assume the same is true for what's going on the Isle of Palms beach side of the inlet?
Yeah, on the Isle of Palms side, Sullivan's is the ultimate recipient of sand from Isle of Palms. So if something is done there that alters that sand supply, then it could have an impact. Now, that sand comes in packages and cycles. As this channel flips and migrates, you get these huge shoal attachments that have been going on for decades. So that's not going to change. If a project's done to artificially relocate the inlet, which is a natural, kind of mimicking the natural process, so it could adjust the timing of that and potentially the scale of that particular event. So I don't want to say that there's no chance that anything that they do could impact, but ultimately, if they do a nourishment project there, there's sand in the system that's going to be moving into the inlet, but that sand's moving anyway. So there may be some incremental changes to the volumes, but it shouldn't be any, dynamic change to the processes occurring there.
So on the dry storage, that seems like a new idea that, I don't think we've even discussed that. Is that something where you store it on city property, or you designate an area on or off the island for people to come get that sand, or how does that work?
So right at Breach Inlet, there's the parking lot, and that's an extremely wide right-of-way between the curb on Jasper Boulevard and that parking lot. It all belongs to the DOT, as does the parking lot. But moving further south, the town owns about 8 lots. Some are high ground, others are underwater right now. So we do have the luxury of hopefully, and it might be necessary to move that sand there once it's deposited by the Army Corps, but we do have the ability to store some sand on town property.
Thank you.
So I don't know, Andy or Pat or Nicole, if maybe talk a little more strategically or longer term around what your view of the beach is. We're looking at beach renourishments and putting in permits and doing different things. Is, kind of what's the status of life, I guess, on Sullivan's from short and long-term beach?
Well, I mean, as you know, we're in a pretty fortunate position with regard to that. In fact, I think this will be I think this will be the first beach renourishment the town has ever participated in, Andy, if I'm
To my
correct about that.
knowledge,
So
yeah.
it's all new to us. And I think it's fair to say it's more in response to this opportunity that the beneficial use project has presented to us. So it's not something that we would have come up with, I think, independent of that. I think we need to see how that works for both sides of the inlet and then proceed from there. I don't see a great need for renourishment in other places of our beach other than, as Andy said, on the western side, sort of the other side of the fort. Andy, you want to add?
Yeah, and I mean, historically, I don't know that the town has ever participated in a renourishment project. The ends, just by the coastal dynamics or littoral dynamics, always seem to have erosion problems on any barrier island, I think. And at least on Sullivan's Island, it's always been the position of the town council that if someone wanted to renourish, it would be at their expense, for their account, not really the town's. And again, on the eastern end, I don't know that there's ever been any more than 2 blocks that seems to come and go with erosion problems. Sometimes the ocean threatens, and other times it seems to be accreting. So
Anything abnormal in the last few years? I mean, is from your perspective, have the last few years been normal cycles of erosion or anything unusual from what you've seen in the past?
I think they've been pretty normal, consistent with, I've been there my whole life, and I don't know that I paid attention to erosion when I was 15 years old. My parents said, never swim at Breach Inlet. That's the first thing you want to do is jump off the bridge. So, and it's always, sort of been an erosion problem there. But just recently, I've noticed that, not so much on the Sullivan's Island side, but the Isle of Palms side, there seems to be more erosion than I ever remembered on the western end of Isle of Palms. I don't know that I've ever seen it like that. And the inlet itself, the shoal, I don't know that I can remember seeing it. I think you can almost walk across at low tide now. So I don't, in my lifetime, I don't remember seeing it like that. Is that abnormal? I don't know. It seems to always, the center line of the channel always seems to shift, I think. So if you did a longitudinal study, I don't know that it's any more abnormal than what it might have been 60 or 70 years ago. I just don't know.
Nicole, anything you want to add to that conversation?
I concur. Yeah, there's been some sand projects that have moved sand around, some private projects that have put up a dune here and there, but generally Sullivan's is in more of a sand management mode where they have plenty. It's just sometimes not in the right spot. So that's the focus, and I think will be into the future.
So have you all had any successes on the western end? I know that you all, do something different, it appears, allowing, having people, private individuals put sand in. It sounds like I've seen revetments on that side, groins, anything that's particularly been helpful in dealing with the erosion regarding the private property.
I'll start, and Andy can elaborate and/or correct, but I think the revetments, the groins have been there for years and years and years. Currently, we're seeing more of them than we used to because they've been more exposed in some areas with some loss of beach there. Some of the nearby residents are blaming it on the Harbor Channel deepening project, which seems to be a far cry from likely, but I could be wrong about that. Andrew?
there are no new structures on the beach at Sullivan's Island that have been put in place since DHEC, would not allow them. So what you see has been out there since probably as early as the 1930, on the western end where the Army put those walls out, and then there are a few groins and seawalls that might have popped up in the late 60s, but there really hasn't been anything new added. And again, as the mayor said, when there is that unusual erosion, sometimes it will expose those old structures, but generally they're covered up. I mean, there's a section of the North Jetty that comes ashore right at the school, and I don't know that I've seen that in the last 15 years. It's just normally accreting. But DHEC says that walls are bad, so we don't have any new walls, if that answers your question. So.
Or new strategies. Again, the key is what are the people on the western side doing if they're suffering from erosion?
I'll add to that a little bit. We actually are doing a study for some of those owners on the west side to evaluate those structures, and I think some of those date back to pre-Civil War period. The zigzag-shaped structure, I mean, they've been there a long time. And so we're looking at, their erosion, their beach is much smaller beach. The volumes are much smaller than you deal with on a ocean-facing shoreline. So if they get 10 feet of erosion, that's pretty severe, from their perspective. But you have the documented sea level rise that's occurred, from 1850 especially to now is probably 1.5 feet or almost 2 feet. So those structures that were originally built at a certain elevation are in effect 2 feet lower than they were when they were designed. So they're getting more wave energy over those structures, which may be impacting the beach. And also, as bigger ships are coming into the harbor, on top of that water level, you're getting bigger wakes over those as well. So they're getting that kind of ship wake, and storm energy over those structures. So while there may not be any significant change in processes going on, just the result of sea level rise and that thing may be having an impact on their beach. So those are things we're trying to tease out of the data. But, it's a dynamic inlet that has a lot of different forces affecting it.
Thank you. I was just looking for any tips for success. Okay.
I remember, I don't know if it was Nicole or Steve, maybe you said some of the municipalities have hired people on staff now to monitor their beaches. Do you actively monitor your beach yourselves? I know we've engaged Steve to help us on an intermittent kind of basis, but were you one of the municipalities that actually hired somebody that monitors, and if so?
We have a well-regarded coastal engineer who comes in every year to do that for
Okay,
us.
all right. So
Yeah. She's on Zoom.
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah.
Good.
Other questions?
Well, I guess one question, I mean, it sounds like you guys are, as a town, you're more not as interested in doing any sort of large beach renourishment project. But if it came to the time that Isle of Palms was interested in doing something at Breach Inlet that would either affect y'all or necessitate your assistance, is that something that the town would have interest in, or is it something that you would just, I mean, obviously, it sounds like from a monetary standpoint, not as much, but I'm just curious kind of where we would stand if we got into a project and needed Sullivan's.
No, I mean, I think we'd be open to discussing anything. I think the desirability of it from our standpoint would depend on what the circumstances are and what the project is. If you had said to us 2 years ago, we're going to would you like to have 175,000 cubic feet of sand? We'd say, well, where on earth is it going to come from? Never mind. But the opportunity presented itself. So we definitely would like to discuss that, see whether it is relevant to us and whether it would be helpful. And we also just don't want to get in the way of what you guys are doing. I mean, I come out to the IOP for brunch every weekend, and I get to see the trucks dumping sand out there or scraping it, and then the next weekend I get to see it gone. So it's very clear y'all are dealing with a really challenging situation.
That's good to hear. Thank you. That's helpful.
I guess, Stephen, you've got Breach Inlet up. Do you want to walk through some of that while our Sullivan's Island folks are here, or?
Sure. Just we did a survey 2 weeks ago now of the inlet. And I just wanted to go through a couple of little changes that we've observed. I'm not sure if the laser pointer works on this, but what you're seeing now is a survey done in August of '23. And I'm going to jump back and forth several times to go between. So March 24, this was the most recent one. So if I can, this goes fast enough. So 23, 24, 23, 24. So you see the whole channel and northern shoal shifting to the south and to the west. And that's kind of the process that we've kind of talked about a good bit. Going back a couple of years prior to this, it would have been further to the north. And what's happening is that shifting to the west, the contours on the right side of that shoal, so the right side of the yellow area, have been shifting closer to Isle of Palms and further south as well.
Is the yellow kind of like sandbar?
Yes, so yellow is the shallower sand.
And the green is?
The blue is the deeper water, the channel.
What's the
and
green on the left?
The green on the left.
Aerial.
That's the satellite imagery.
Oh,
Oh, okay.
yeah, that's just where our
That's
data
right.
coverage stops.
Okay.
Sullivan's Island's not paying.
That's the new tennis courts and rec center they're putting in.
Pickleball.
Exactly.
I think I did meet a triangle
Sorry.
there. Yeah, no, that's okay. I'm used to looking at these things, so I assume everybody else, and that's a bad assumption. But, what we've noticed over the past 2 to 3 years is those contours that are kind of out in that area to the right of the yellow, those have been shifting closer to Isle of Palms, and that's letting more wave energy get to Breach Inlet. So there's just a general sense of sand shifting.
Stephen, that contour?
Yes.
That line?
Well, right where you're pointing is another feature I'll point out. So, put your hand back there again, Doug. Right there, you'll notice there's a little channel right off the right off the tip of the island right there. That's the marginal flood channel, and that's a ephemeral feature that sometimes it's there and sometimes it's not. And it kind of moves closer and further away from the beach, and that can also impact the beach condition right there off the tip. In '23, it really wasn't there, and it hasn't, and that's allowed, when it is there, it actually creates a little mini delta of its own on the seaward side and pushes those contours further seaward. So that's happened this past year, as that channel's opened up and has pushed some of the contours right where Doug's hand is further seaward. So that's,
So move this line out.
yeah.
That line.
Or south? They move more south, I don't know.
Out and south, probably both directions. Sorry.
So when you're losing sand off the tip, that's where it's going?
Yeah, some of it's going in there, but as that builds out, it also does help provide some protection. But eventually what's going to happen is that channel will cut through a little south of where Doug's hand, right about somewhere in that vicinity is where we historically see it cut through. And that usually occurs when the main channel is just a little further south from its current position.
And it goes east,
It will.
when you say cuts through?
It will cut through that shoal, and the orientation could be due south, it could be a little deflected to the east. And we have data to show that, and I'll put it together in a more complete visual package and send to y'all. But that's really what the trigger to affect this natural channel relocation is when the main channel reaches a little further west of its current position. We see it flip back to the north. And it may be one channel, it may be 2 or 3 smaller channels. The details of the events are a little unpredictable, but we just know, the general process.
How
So-
long does something like that, in your forecast, how long would it take?
Yeah, I think it's kind of an ongoing process, but it may take 12 months for the channel to fully develop, to a full cross-section. But I expect that to start
Scott, you're asking,
occurring.
So this kind of compresses over time, and then Stephen, you're saying it'll cut back through here. How long does that whole Once it cuts
So-
back
Yeah,
here.
the
and then
entire
starts-
cycle of migration and relocation is probably a 6 to 7 year cycle. So it'll break through, migrate to the south over a period of 5 to 6 years, and then break through again. When it does break through, it's much like that little flood channel built to Little Delta. It's going to deposit a lot of sand back to where those contours were a couple of years ago, and we're hopeful that that kind of backs up sand along the south end of the
Okay, so
Ponds.
if that happens naturally, what's going to happen if we drop 550,000 cubic yards just north of that? And will it impact the channel migration at all, or in your opinion?
The sand's going there regardless. So whether it's sand that was placed by the Corps or whether it's sand that's coming out of your dune field, the waves that are pushing the sand aren't going to change. So sand is going to be coming through, off the beach to that inlet regardless. You may see an incremental increase in the amount initially because it's going to be kind of out in the water, so it may move a little faster at first. But I don't think it's going to be, when you're talking about scales, I mean, there's a couple of million yards of sand in that delta, several million yards of sand, and, they're putting 500,000 on the beach. So the increase is going to be very minor.
But it could speed up the process a little bit, maybe? Maybe not?
Yeah, I don't think it's going to be something where you could actually measure
We're
it.
not gonna be able to.
There's just too many other natural forces to be able to have a cause and effect there.
So does any of this change any of your opinions on Breach Inlet that we talked about 2 weeks ago, whether or not it was clogging or needed dredging, or ultimately, that's what, obviously, I think we'd all like to hear as you go through this.
Yeah, again, I don't think that there's anything that's clogging the inlet. It's just that it's this natural reconfiguration of the shoals and the channel. It's just a natural evolution of it. The channel is going to maintain a cross-sectional area that's based off of the volume of water that goes through it, not the amount of sand that's moving on the seaward side of it. So the channel isn't clogging. Relocating the inlet manually, you're essentially doing what nature is going to be doing by itself over the next, again, I'm assuming 12 months, maybe 24 at the most, I would think, to get this new channel, opened and developed. And the complications with doing it manually is you got to know what to do with the sand that you dredge out. Some of it may need to go into the old channel to help block it off. Some of it should go to Sullivan's Island to help kind of restore their beach and address any potential impacts that they would face. And then whatever's left could go on Isle of Palms Beach. But it's probably not sufficient volume by itself to do a comprehensive beach restoration of that, from south of the pier on.
And Stephen, if I'm hearing you correctly, nature over time is going to change the channel and start to deposit sand back on the beach on Isle of Palms as that moves and as those contours change, changing the wave energy and the physics of it, right?
Yes. Now, what I can't tell you is exactly how much is it going to build back.
Yeah.
Historically speaking, and I was talking with Doug about this earlier, if you go back from 1940 to 2000, that beach has just grown incredibly. They were able to build 2 more rows of houses. So it's been accretional over the history. And as scientists and engineers, you look at that and say, well, nothing has really changed other than sea level's gone up some. So we would expect that to continue. So we're in an erosional cycle right now, but
Yeah.
you look at the trend, it should go
But the
up.
bottom line is patience is
But,
kind of
yeah.
important here.
Yeah, but over the past 10 years, it seems like, if we just go by that, then, okay, that area is erosional, and over the past 5 years, it's been highly erosional.
Yeah.
So at some point, you kind of have to say, when do we change our understanding of the processes down there and manage it in a different way?
Okay.
After Hurricane Matthew and even after Hurricane Sandy in 2012, we had some erosion and said, look, just be patient, it'll come back. And it came back, pretty well. But I can't tell you that if this naturally happens, that you're going to gain 60 feet of beach, back up to 5th, 6th, 7th Avenue.
That's going to go back to what it was. It just,
Right.
some may come back.
Right.
How much? Okay.
And it may all come back naturally by itself. It's just not something you can, really pin down.
All right.
And would I be correct, again, we're looking at a sustainable plan over decades as we move forward, that this is going to continue, we're going to see this go on back and forth, and now we don't know the rate at which it will go to the good side or the bad side, because things have changed.
Right, with higher sea levels, with the amount of storms we've had, again, it could be a fluke. We've just, up and down the coast the past 5 years, everywhere we go, we say it's just been bad. And that's the simplest way to say it. if that changes, it's great. Everybody's in a little bit better position. But until that changes, we kind of have to start assuming that this may be a new normal.
Thank you. That's what I wanted to make sure we weren't looking too optimistically. I mean, I'd love to
Yeah,
be
for the
the
best, plan for the
rainbows and
worst.
unicorns in the room, but I think we should be planning that things are a little different.
Yes, and we were including, a full-scale nourishment option in our planning, a couple of years ago for this end, is starting the search for sand, which we're doing borings for that in the next couple of weeks to look at possible sand sources outside of the east end, coordinating with SHPO. So we were working towards that. Just the erosion really the past years accelerated that timeline.
If you were, if we could turn back the clock 5 years and see what was going to happen. So like if we're thinking forward, if this inlet seems to kind of have a rhythm to it. Is this, it sounds like realigning the inlet wouldn't make sense now because by the time we got permits and everything, nature would do it itself.
Right.
But would it make sense in the future to have a plan and a permitting or permission or whatever to start that, like the next time we start to see if we do get into more of an erosional cycle down there, if 5 years, 10 years down the road, we see that like kind of this same thing is happening again, would it make sense then to realign the inlet, or is it still better to just re-nourish and then let nature deal with the inlet?
Yeah, I like having as many tools as you can to manage a beach. So I don't want to say that any option is a bad option. You want to look at the cost. I think you'd have to have an ocean certified dredge in that area. So your mobilization is already going to be significant. So at that point, you're asking, is it better to bring in new sand to the system, or you're recycling the same volume within the system? Ideally, you're adding new sand, even if it is a little bit more expensive, because then you're increasing your bank account. So that's a positive. And that project is a little bit more predictable as to what's going to happen. You're just adding sand to your beach. You're not impacting the inlet and kind of letting it continue to adjust naturally. So I think it's a better project, but having the ability to handle it in multiple ways, there may be some advantages. I mean, it would be cheaper to pump sand from that inlet because it's a shorter distance. Your mobilization would be less because you don't have to bring in as much pipe. So it would be a cheaper project, but I can't tell you it would be a better project.
Would the inlet area be a candidate for a maintenance kind of place to get sand? Say we pump a lot of sand onto the beach, get our base going, we get our ideal beach, and then use the sand that will eventually erode into the delta area there, and use that to maintain the beaches as they are, as a source of sand?
Yeah, I think, if the accessible part of the spit from the land has grown significantly, and we can say that, yes, there's a volume of sand that we can harvest from that, recycle back to the north, because that can be done very cheaply. I think that is a useful tool to have in limited scales. I don't think you're going to get 200,000 yards off of it, using land-based equipment.
But you could stop a hot spot or
Yes, you could,
get ahead of
yeah.
something if you need to.
Yeah, or
to
serve
buy
as
it.
like post-storm emergency restoration type
Right,
work.
but that could be included in a plan moving forward,
Yeah,
to
it'd
be
be very-
proactive.
It'd be very similar to the shoal management permit that we're applying for at the east end.
Would you recommend that? Because it seems to me like we make repairs, and then we wait until things are in a dire situation, and then we react to it. But if we have something we can maintain, for example, going into that area to pull it up and patch things up, would that be a better plan than what we're doing now, just based on everything that's happened? I know 5 years ago, you projected into the future, you would have thought we had 7 to 10 years. Now, if you projected, if things stay like they are, we're talking more like every 5 years to do something. So would using a patch like this be a good idea, in your opinion, in the future?
You're referring to specifically at the south end or in general?
Just in general.
Yeah, again, it's another tool in the toolbox to have. I think especially at Isle of Palms, with the way your shoals and inlets are so dynamic, that you have, sometimes like the Sullivans too, sand quantity isn't necessarily your problem, it's where the sand's at.
Well, I get that it's another tool we have, but isn't it something that, would you recommend that we focus on trying to do that in the future so that we don't get to the dire situation? That would prolong it maybe and help us get more towards the 7 years or the 10 years?
Yes.
Okay.
So,
Can we get
go ahead,
Nicole,
Phil.
let's get Nicole on the, I just want to give her an opportunity to opine while she's with us.
Sure, thank you. Yeah, I agree that this Breach Island could be worked into a long-term plan that could be beneficial to both communities. We oftentimes in those briefings that Mayor O'Neill just mentioned, I get asked this question every year: when's the sandbar going to attach? And we just don't know. So if we could study it enough to have a fairly high level of confidence that CSE are the experts really in this sort of encouraging an inlet to bypass a sandbar when we want it to, that could be a strategy that I think both communities could benefit from.
Thank you, Nicole.
So,
Cindy.
Philip, all I was going to ask is, one thing I wanted to bring up today was going to be starting to move forward with an action plan to put together a beach management plan. And before we do that, I just wanted to ask if Stephen could go through the slides that you had sent to us, and then I'd like to maybe bring that up to the floor. But I'd like that information because I think it plays into what we'd be discussing.
Yeah, those graphs weren't self-explanatory to you.
I found those to be incredibly confusing, but I know that's because I'm not a professional.
Well, again, I think we are building towards an action plan to these questions and conversations and Army Corps coming in, and I think the funnel's starting to get narrow here. I want to be cognizant of Nicole, who's, I think, on vacation, and our Sullivan's Island folks. I mean, y'all are more than welcome to sit through this. One of the things we tasked Stephen with 2 meetings ago was if we're going to define what an ideal beach looks like, is that 50 feet, 100 feet, that kind of starts the process for putting together a plan to say if it's a 5-year program, a 10-year program, how do we pay for it, where do we get the sand? That's what Stephen and crew have come back to us with some very attractive graphs that need some narrative, for sure.
Next time I'll put them in English.
So y'all are more than welcome, but, I mean, it all does play
I'd
together.
like to hang around for a little bit
Please
longer,
do.
if that's okay.
There's no lunch.
If you
Let me run then, sorry.
Is there a relationship to the loss of sand, say from 6th or 5th Avenue towards the western end of Isle of Palms to where the shoal or the channel of Breach Inlet now rests?
The channel is in this constant state of migration.
Right.
So but the volume of sand on the shoal is going to vary from event to event. And where the new breach happens, the further east it happens, more sand is going to be between the old channel and the new channel, which is all that sand is what's coming onto Sullivan's Island.
Right.
So I think that's really what would control the volume, but all that sand is sourced from Isle of Palms.
So if the channel were to move further to the east, is there an expectation that the profile of that sandbar would not be as far south as it is in this photograph? If I understand shoal bypassing, that's why we have some erosional issues from Station 30 to the 32 or the end of the island, because the source of sand is kind of moving out and around before it comes back in. Is that kind of?
Well, I think, and Nicole, please jump in if you want to here, but, Breach Inlet, historically, take out all the structures and everything, was a migratory inlet. So the throat of the inlet, where the bridge is now, would have been migrating into Sullivan's Island, and then every so often, and it may be a 50-year interval, it would relocate well north into Isle of Palms, into the developed area. So the entire system would have been migrating over a several 1,000-foot corridor. Once those structures were put in on Sullivan's Island, it essentially fixed the southern boundary of Breach Inlet in place. So rather than the entire system migrating, now all the it occurs within a very narrow range compared to the historical one, and all the work is kind of occurring out on the seaward side of it. I don't think you're going to get a huge, there's very little opportunity for sand to maintain itself naturally anymore along that southern edge of Breach Inlet, between the bridge and, the kind of the terminus of that seawall where it really juts out there.
So that's a battle we'll always fight
Yeah,
on our side.
You'll get some shoal attachments that happen further towards the north, which may temporarily overwhelm the system with sand and feed some sand along that area. But over a couple of years, it's going to erode again, and most of your accumulation is going to occur out on the front part of the beach.
So as we learn how to pronounce the word renourishment on Sullivan's Island, we probably ought to be thinking about some ongoing program for that southern edge of Breach Inlet, from the park
Kind of
down
the
to the
transition
curve
zone.
of the island. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, the structures that extend way out, that first structure that's way out in the channel, I don't think there's any sustainable way to maintain a sandy shoreline without, significant groins extending out into the channel. Just even with that, it'd be very difficult with the way it's been fixed in place. That transition zone further around, I think you have a better shot, and that's where we're planning on putting a dune in with this core project. And this core project really will be
Tell me on there, what do you mean by further around?
kind of where that little bulge of sand is on the shoreline.
So Stephen, you're saying this would always be a challenge to maintain?
From the bottom part of that south, so from that area, there's, I think, very little hope of maintaining any sand beach there. You can probably maintain some incremental sand north of there from the park, because that protrusion in the wall is going to act like a groin for a while. But then south of there, even further south, from that point south is where you would have the ability to maintain some sand, but it will be at the influence of the shoal attachments. So that'll be your most dynamic area where sometimes it's beach, sometimes it's not.
Yeah, this may be, go ahead.
Oh, the sand that has to get dredged out of the waterway regularly, where's it coming from?
It's some amount of, our inlets are ebb dominant, meaning most of the sand that's coming along the beach gets deposited on the seaward side of the inlets. So it's out in the deltas. Some sand does work up into it, but a large quantity of that material ends up being mud. That's just the fine material that's in the water. Every high tide, as the water calms down, some of that settles down. And so that's why a lot of times what they're pumping is not beach compatible. Right around an inlet, though, some sand is worked by waves up into the system. And so some of that is coming from the beach, but it's not a huge amount that's coming from the beach into those areas.
What is coming from the beach that's sort of being recycled?
Yeah, it falls into the
Up
channel.
the waterway and then back, up to the waterway and then back down.
Yeah, the ebb currents tend to push most of that sand back out into the ocean.
Probably an unpopular suggestion, but we've got the fixed nature of the Sullivan's Island side of Breach Inlet. What would a terminal groin or something on the Isle of Palm side do to our requirements going forward for this movement? Would that mitigate most of what we're trying to solve for?
Yeah, so a terminal groin could be effective in that area if the erosion continues to kind of persist the way it has the past 2 or 3 years. Generally speaking, we did one at Folly Beach County Park in 2013, and that county park had been nourished dozens of times by the Corps through beneficial use projects or dredging of the waterway behind Folly Island. And those projects may last a year or two before they were eroded. So it had a very high erosion rate. We put in a 700-foot-long terminal groin, and it's helped hold that park in for the past 10 years and it's performed really well. So it can be done there. Anytime you add a groin, you have to nourish the beach to basically fill up the trapping capacity. And if this area had been chronically eroding, it's something we already would have kind of looked at, whether it's feasible, economical, and what the benefits of that would be. The state requires that you have to show that the area is chronically eroding. And before 2 years ago, we wouldn't have been able to show that. Now, if it persists, then I think we could say, hey, this is a viable candidate for that type of structure.
how hard would it be or what would be involved? And, you know, we may not go down that road as an option, but I certainly would be interested in seeing what that option looks like and the cost, because if we're faced with, you know, $20 million beach renourishments into perpetuity here, that's probably not going to be viable for our city finances.
Right, so it's like any other normal critical area permit, major permit, so you have to go through the state and federal permitting agencies. The difference is you have to have a downdrift impact analysis with any type of groin structure. And so you evaluate the system, you might have to do some modeling to show how that structure is going to impact sediment transport past it. So basically how would it impact Breach Inlet, and then ultimately how would it impact Sullivan's Island. So you'd have to document that, you know, the way you design the structure is not going to have a negative impact to those areas. And if it did, how are you going to mitigate that? Whether it's placing sand, adjusting the structure, or removing the structure.
How expensive is that study? Just a guess.
It depends on the level of modeling that would be involved, but I would say that just the baseline study is probably on the order of $50,000 to $75,000 to do the downdrift impact analysis. Hydrodynamic modeling of this type of system is a very expensive type thing, and maybe another $100K to do that.
In light of where we are right now, would you recommend it? Just to consider as an alternative?
Where we're at today, I would like to see how this core project is going to work and evolve, and if it looks like it, you know, through infrequent additions of modest amounts of sand, you know, that area can be sustained, then that's the preferred route. However, if it looks like that project is not going to last very long, or this erosion rate that we're measuring, you know, persists for the next, you know, 3, 4, 5 years, then, you know, I think that would be a very worthwhile effort. And not saying you couldn't do the study now and then, you know, see how it evolves afterwards too.
Would it change, though? In 2 years, could the study be different because of the change with the beach?
You would have to update some, so, I mean, generally speaking, you know, the overall dynamics would be the same. You know, just the site-specific conditions at the time would be a little different, but not substantially.
Yeah, it seems like this might be, I would consider maybe a relatively inexpensive tool to have in our toolbox if we need it. If we don't need it, we don't need it. But for 50 or 75,000, might be worth having the study done.
But don't lose sight of the renourishment
Yeah,
that you've got to do to build that. I mean, you still got a $20 million potential to get to that structure.
Yeah, and, you know, there's a lot of alternatives you could look at with that. You don't have to necessarily do a $20 million project. You just need to show that you've added the amount of sand that growing will trap.
Gotcha.
What does the state deem persistent? I mean, if we've been 18 months, are they going to say you need another 4 years, or is that?
I don't think they have I don't think the regulations actually specify what that means. And, you know, any kind of growing structure, you're likely to get challenged by some of the NGO groups. And that's where they would use that uncertainty to say, no, that area is not, you know, you're going through an erosional cycle, you're not chronically eroding.
And the growing structure, if one was proposed or recommended, it would not impact the north side, it would impact the south side, correct?
It would positively impact the north side by trapping additional sand. So you're reducing the erosion rate north of that structure, on the upcoast side of the structure.
The structures on the south side, which they would obviously be homes.
Yeah.
On the south side, would start to lose more sand.
The idea with the
These are
terminal,
hard.
yeah, the idea with the terminal groin is that it's occurring at an inlet. So that inlet's kind of the buffer between a downdrift shoreline.
Okay.
What happened with groins, and why they kind of got a bad reputation, yeah, and that's where the study would kind of select where the optimum spot is to place that north or south. You wouldn't want to put it so far south that it's likely to get flanked by the channel or erosion occurring on the north side of it, so you put it further north, you know, somewhere. I forgot where I was going with it.
We're talking about structure, I was asking
Yeah.
about the structure south of the groin, because I
Yeah.
mean, based off the way the angle and the perpendicular movement
Right.
of wave action,
So when
somebody's gonna lose in that. on-
yeah,
at
when
least on
groins were
our
first
lots.
like installed as a common practice in the 30s and 40s, they were put on the center of a beach, you know, on a chronically eroded shoreline without any additional sand. So they had to immediately start blocking sand that was moving on the updrift side and eroding on the downdrift side. And that's rightfully so, why they got kind of a bad reputation is because then you'd have to add another groin to fix that problem, and you end up with a groin field.
It looks like Long Island, which
Yes.
is groins every like
But it
quarter mile.
does keep the beach in place.
Yes.
You know, Edisto Beach, Pawleys Island, you know, those groins have held those beaches in place
Okay.
for long term. With a terminal groin, that inlet is kind of the buffer from any downdrift impacts. As long as you're not impacting immediately downdrift, like, you know, if it is up on the beach and there's a couple of houses south, you want to make sure that those are not going to be negatively impacted.
Gotcha. Okay.
I drive this bridge every day, and I should know this, but I know the house that sticks out with all the rocks, but on the Sullivan's Island side, are the structures that are there now, would that help mitigate? I mean, if this section is nothing that they could ever hope to maintain any sort of beach, would that be helpful in that analysis, that they have this effective breakwater or whatever it is?
With the terminal groin?
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't think it would have any impact on, you know, waves hitting that. It wouldn't be long enough to actually affect, you know, wave energy hitting those structures.
And it would have no impact on the Wild Dunes Beach.
No.
So when we talked about the $20 million, the $20 million was including both parts of it. This would only include the part down north. So it wouldn't, even if you had to do the whole renourishment, you wouldn't have to renourish that part of it fully.
You would only.
Or the extra cost wouldn't be duplicative, because you're building up the future, so you have a groin that protects you from having to protect that part of the beach in the future. And then the city only has the expense on the other part, which is Wild
Yes,
Dunes.
and a groin is not a permanent sand retaining structure. They act to slow the erosion rate where it is manageable, and that's why they're used in highly eroding shorelines. You know, you still have to nourish that beach every so often in most situations. Now, like at the north end of Hunting Island, there's been a terminal groin since, I think, 1969, and sometimes it's exposed, but most of the time it's completely buried. And if we were to build one here and the beach does go into an accretional cycle or through nourishment, that structure could be mostly buried for a long time, which is ideal. You know, when the beach does erode, it becomes exposed and then it starts working. And that would be the hope, is that you design it in a way where it's keeping you from critical erosion, but it's not well beyond what it needs to be effective.
It sounds to me like we're hearing though is that sitting here today, we would not have the evidence to support the need for a groin there. Is that right? I mean, we've got, 40 years of accretional beach and 1.5 years of erosion? So I feel like we'd be coming up against some pretty strong opposition with the state, and then also, as you were saying, with the other organizations, if we were to try to do that now. Is that?
I think it's a legitimate concern. Again, if it's 5 years of this kind of continued erosion,
Then
then I
that would
think we
be
have a
something that
stronger
would be
case.
a legitimate argument.
Thank you very much for inviting us to join y'all
Thank you.
today, and let's please keep talking. I was thinking during this discussion, I grew up in South Louisiana on stories about the flood of 1927. And the people living along the river, upriver of New Orleans, had this great suspicion that somebody was going to dynamite the levee upriver of New Orleans to take the burden off of New Orleans to save it. So everybody was thinking somebody else was going to blow up the levee right where they were and flood them. So I started to have this picture of people on either side of Breach Inlet with field glasses, looking at that other guy with field glasses, wondering what he's up to.
What are they doing?
Pretty sure that's happened before.
Commissioner Copy.
Thank y'all very much.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Andy, that was from the 50th anniversary of IOP.
What year was that?
25 years ago,
25 years ago.
24
Coming
years.
up in
Yeah.
Sep-
Amy was going through some archives the other day. We had a couple of them, so take that one with you.
Boys grew up and
Yeah.
Dad got gray hair.
And nowhere, kind of.
Thank you, Mayor.
Thanks.
Nicole, your Sullivan's Island.
Run like the wind.
are Leaving, you're welcome to stay. You want to bow out with them and get back
All right,
to
well,
vacation?
Don't wait on me.
Yes, please.
All right,
It was good to see everybody.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Nicole.
Thank you. Talk to you
Thank you.
soon.
All right, bye-bye.
Okay.
Stephen,
Onward to.
your show.
How many caveats can I make here? So, all right, so we were tasked with coming up with a ideal healthy beach volume, or an ideal minimum beach volume. And before we get too far along in that, I kind of want to go through what that means and the risks, or the understanding that we need to have with that before we, take it as more than it might actually mean. What's shown here is the beach volumes for about the past 5 years along the entire front beach of Isle of Palms. I stop at the links course. I don't go around the Dewey's Inlet shoreline because it's just a different shape, and it would make things a little bit more complicated. So a beach volume is impacted by a couple of things. Generally, it's the slope of the beach going all the way out into the water where you have sandbars and things. So if you're near an inlet, you have a lot more sand underwater because you have the sandbars with the inlet that are kind of increasing the volume. So that's why if you look at the very left side of this graph, the breach inlet volumes spike way up. That doesn't mean that your beach condition is a lot healthier. It just means there's a lot more sand naturally in that profile, but a lot of that sand's out in the water. So you have to account for that. And the same can be true on a beach where you have a steeper beach, like on the Dewey's Inlet shoreline. It takes less sand to maintain a dune because the beach profile is a lot steeper, so there's less volume in it, but the beach can be wider. And then these volumes are all relative to the seaward side of buildings. We essentially drew a generic line along the seaward side of the buildings. So if a building is set further back than an adjacent area, it's going to show a higher relative volume because it's set further back from the ocean. So there may be a straight shoreline, but the volume jumps way up. And that's what happens at 21st Avenue, is that's where that's where the houses kind of jump way back. So those volumes spike way up, which is great. But that's why you see these quick fluctuations in things. So when we're looking at this, you really don't want to pin down on single data points. You want to look at it in a very kind of generic, general manner, because there are these kind of nuances in the data that make it a little complicated. And that's why you get some of these spikes, is because at that particular location, the structures may be set back a little bit further relative to their neighbors, or something that extends further seaward, or there may be something in the profile, like adjacent to the pier. There may be additional sand that the pier is allowing to settle out that increases that volume relative to the adjacent shorelines. So this minimum healthy beach volume, I generally set at 450 cubic yards per foot as a theoretical example based off of conditions that we surveyed in March. And I looked at Station 80, which is just south of the pier, as what looks to be a very healthy beach. And that actually kind of spikes up the volume. So I did a little bit more analysis, and I'm kind of thinking that 450 is probably a very high threshold as an ideal volume. And I'll show you that here in a second. So I don't want you to think that anything that's shown here now is what we're recommending be adopted by the city. This is kind of an example, and we can tweak it, and I'll explain how those adjustments will affect, some of the planning. But generally, you can see the volumes that are present there. The breach inlet side and 6th Avenue there is labeled where it jumps up at 21st Avenue. That's from the pier south, essentially. That center section of the beach from 21st Avenue to Citadel House is all pretty consistent. And then as you get starting into Wild Dunes, you see a highly dynamic where it jumps way down and jumps way back up, and that's with the patterns up there with the shoals and the erosion. And the shoals really add sand just like the inlet does. The shoals that are offshore, even if the sand's kind of way out in the water, they can increase your volume, but you might not have the beach width to show it. So we could do a similar analysis just looking at dune volume. And that's our dune width, not dune volume. So just distance of like dry sand area from the houses. And that may be useful as well to look at, but volumes are what you use to build beaches and kind of quantify things. So I hope I've caveated that well enough, but to show you what that looks like, this is the line at 480. That's the location of the line, and we survey it way out into the water beyond the red line shown there. But that profile had 450 cubic yards of sand in it 2 weeks ago. And you see, go
So
ahead.
that's for that width of that how is that measured? That,
So it's measured from the left side of that red line
Okay.
all the way out into the water, down to a depth of 13 feet below mean sea level. That's where let me jump ahead and I'll show you that to answer your question. Just don't look at anything there.
close your eyes.
Okay. So if you start at the zero there, the zero is the structure line. That's the seaward side of the house or building, whatever is there that we establish. The volume is the area under these lines, and this is the same profile near 6th Avenue. But if you calculate the area under the line out to where the lines start to merge, even further out than that, about 1,500 feet is where we cut it off. And then we measure it down to 13 feet, which is what we call closure depth. Closure depth is that point offshore where the profiles merge, and you really don't get a lot of sand moving onshore and offshore. Most of the sand, all the change is occurring higher in the profile than that. And that's a common practice with coastal engineers is, quantifying the sand box. So the 450 number would be the volume of sand under that line, at that station. So here, this is 50
Say
of
that again,
that.
Steve. Say that sentence again, please.
So the volume of sand is the area under these curves to those boundaries that we establish. And so each curve has a different volume from year to year.
So it's all this?
Yes.
So the curves are sand.
So the curves are sand.
Like if I was walking on the beach, my feet would be on that blue or red or green line.
You would be
depending on the year.
Right, you'd be right around where Doug's hand is. Zero is mean sea level, so at mid-tide. Yeah.
It's a cross-section
Yeah.
of the.
Yeah, so the dunes on the left, your dry sand beach is usually around +5. The intertidal beach goes down to about -2 is where the low tide beach is. And then anything below -2 is underwater. So those are your sandbars. So we look at these volumes, or each line we calculate a volume for, and the change in that volume between one year and the next is how we get how much sand you've lost or gained year to year.
So is it safe to say the visible beach is going to be the zero on the left? Go to the zero on the left. No, on the left.
Visible.
Yeah.
The left axis, zero.
All the way back.
No,
Right.
zero is the
Oh,
Yeah,
houses.
Oh, this is the house.
yeah, that's, so from the
That's the
house,
Okay, and you're going 500 feet out.
right, so in there you have about 500 feet of visible beach.
Got it.
Okay, you have about 250 feet of dune area, 250 feet of dune, well, in the black condition there. So this particular profile shows the existing condition at 6th Avenue for 4 different dates, from '09 to '24. But then it also shows what the condition would look like if it did hold that 450-foot minimum. So it shows how far seaward you would have to shift the profile to get it to meet that kind of minimum thing, minimum volume. Okay, and here it was about 90 feet that you have to shift the profile seaward to get to that healthy condition. And again, at 6th Avenue, I think it's very conservative, meaning it's a very healthy section. I think for management, we probably want to pull that back, and I'll go into some details on that. But that's how we come up with what we call our deficit volume. So the deficit volume is how much sand you need to get the existing condition up to that minimum healthy condition. And I mentioned what the deficit volumes are a little bit later. But that's what we're looking at in this.
I'm slow. Can you go back one more?
Sure.
So where I'm looking at right now, if I went to the red, between the red line and the black line at the 500 foot, that would be the requirement.
Between the red line and black line at 500 feet. Yeah.
Right, you're saying ideal is 450, and we're at the red line, so we're deficit, the fill-in would be between the red and the black?
Right.
Okay.
Right. And so that volume right now for that particular station is, I think, close to 100 cubic yards per foot of beach.
Okay.
Okay, so that's what's shown, well, on the last slide now. But basically, the difference between where that red dotted line is, which is at 450, and the orange line, which is where we're at now, that's about 100 cubic yards per foot. So that's the amount of sand you need to add per foot of beach. So if you have 1,000 feet of beach, You need to add 100,000 yards to get up to that healthy condition. Okay.
Now, that gets us to the healthy condition, but if we were going to do a renourishment, we wanted to do one every 5 years, we'd have to overshoot that by, that becomes a calculation of how much sand do we put on there to last for 3 years, 5 years,
Right.
whatever.
So
basically.
that's this last graph that I'll jump to and kind of go out of order here.
Okay.
So this one shows the deficit volume in the blue. So that if we're focusing again on the left area, it's around that 100 cubic yards per foot number. The orange line, you have to look at the axis on the right, and that shows your erosion rate over the past 5 years. So let's say that erosion rate has averaged 5 cubic yards per foot over the past 5 years. So that's 50 yards per foot over the 10 years. So you have to add an additional 50 yards per foot of sand in those areas to account for the future erosion. Okay, and that's how you
So
start.
100 goes to 150 to get you the 5 years.
Correct. Okay, and that's what these numbers up at the top show. So the deficit volume in that area, based off of that 450 number, was about 700,000 yards, which, again, I think is high. The erosion volume, that doesn't change based off of the ideal you pick. That number is kind of fixed in place. So it's about 500,000 yards for 10 years. So that's kind of what you need to say. We need to be planning on adding 500,000 yards of sand every 10 years to that beach to maintain what's there. And then that base volume is to kind of just get back to where we feel comfortable with.
But that's what we're getting from the core, right?
Yeah, we're getting about 400 to 500 from the core. So we'll be getting close to that, 10-year deficit or 10-year erosion rate from the core. So why I say this 450 is kind of conservative, if we look at further south here now, this is, I think, 8th Avenue, close to 8th Avenue on the bottom, that 350, and 7th or 6th Avenue is there at the 360 cubic yards per foot. Those could be considered minimum healthy profiles right now. None of those houses are imminently threatened. If they did have a significant storm, there's still dune width there to be able to take impacts of that storm. So you really could use a lower number, somewhere between, I think, 375 to maybe 400 cubic yards per foot as an ideal profile to the structure. Now, and what that does is if we dropped it from 450 to 400 cubic yards per foot, that takes about 350 cubic yards out of that deficit volume. So there's much less sand that you would have to place to get to that point. So that's the impact of choosing that, really does have a significant impact on your planning, because you don't want to overshoot that ideal to try to maintain, because it just significantly adds to the cost. Again, this should be considered a general goal. Not every single property, those properties that have structures that stick way out, they're going to have less sand in front of them. You kind of have to look at it as a, reach by reach, holistic, certainly. If you get near an inlet, you have to adjust that volume based off the natural topography there. And I mentioned the other items.
So given that, obviously, when we ask for this information, the goal is ultimately for a long-term plan, but in the short term with the sand that's coming, hopefully sooner than later, will this, assuming but confirming, this information will be used by you all as you look at the sand being pumped and then where you're going to actually move it to?
Right, well, with this project, we are going to be a little limited in that our scope is to put it up into the dune to try to at least get a dune built back where we've had a lot of dune erosion.
Okay.
And that's been significant from, recently from 4th Avenue to about 9th. And that should be fairly simple because that's where they're placing sand anyway. We are looking at actually hauling a quantity of sand for the beach south of 2nd Avenue to try to get dry sand put back where there's currently not any dry sand. So those are kind of the two different approaches we're looking for this particular project.
So in other words, and correct me if I'm wrong, we're Katie was pointing out that the 500,000 would kind of go against the, I think you had 700 is what our deficit is. It's not actually completely going against that, or is it? When you say it's building a dune?
It's all part of the same, it doesn't get broken out in those volumes. You're
Okay.
adding sand to that box, so it's all.
It's all in
part
one
of that
box. Okay,
yeah.
that's what I wanted to
Now, if you did,
understand.
if work was only done on half of the area, then the other half wouldn't have those immediate impacts. But you're adding sand with this core project pretty much throughout the entire area, so it'll be a benefit. Now, it will take some time for that sand to adjust to a natural profile, so move up and rebuild some of the dry sand beach beyond what we're planning on doing. But it will happen, within weeks to a couple of months. It'll be building up there. Something else I wanted to point out is there's been some really significant development of the dune area over the last 10 years. This is a picture from 2014, and I'll do the same kind of flip back and forth to 2022.
Where is this?
And where is this?
This is looking, 4th Avenue is on the immediate left. Yep, and then there's 5th and 6th Avenue there. So just within this area, these pictures are overlaid on each other. You can see how many new pools are there. There's 8 new pools. There's 8 new, what I'll call yards or landscaped areas that extend well out onto the beach or onto what was dune field. So looking right there at 5th Avenue, that property north of 5th, right, yeah, where that was in 2014, is now, I'll guess, 50, 60 feet further seaward is where those yards and pools are. So it's going to be up to the city to decide what are you trying to protect and maintain. Our volumes are based off of the seaward side of the houses. We can move that line to the seaward side of the pools. We can move that line to the seaward side of the yards or landscaped areas. Putt greens, there's a lot of different things out there, fences. But the development over the past 10 years has shifted much further seaward than where it was. So now there's a lot more infrastructure in the areas that, okay, you may have had some dune erosion, but you're also working at it from the other way. So now the beach has really shrunk compared to where it was 10 years ago. And I think that's probably added a lot to the concern of that area is, the area's been eroding, but we've not helped it by building all of these things out
Coming
there.
at it from the other way.
Yeah.
I think it's fascinating that whoever it was that developed that area, the beach company, had the forethought to add that max build line, but they, the city, never thought to say that you shouldn't build other things past that line. I mean, it's crazy. I mean, when you look at those pictures, it really tells
In 8 years.
1,000 more. I mean, it says a lot.
But it also says a lot about the erosion, because as you know, we heard earlier, it's been like 40 years of accretion there, so I can assume that they were looking at the historical information as the town probably was at the time when they said that a pool could go in. We're in a really unusual and unexpected, I'm sure, period.
But they did put a max build line there back in the, when was it originally? The 70s? So, I mean, in the 70s, somebody thought that, like, hey, we shouldn't build any farther out.
So there is a little
And we
bit
just
of,
forgot about that. I mean, that's,
so pools specifically, so that area of Ocean Boulevard was developed by the beach company. They established that maximum building line. They also regulated, very much like Wild Dunes does, the architecture, the layout, the siting of various structures. They initially did not allow any pools seaward of the maximum building line, and they kind of held that line for many years. They then, as it got more and more built out, they kind of were less and less interested in regulating it. So there was kind of the few years of them regulating it, that they started allowing pools seaward of the maximum building line. It then got to a point where they said, and a similar thing happened at 53rd to 56th Avenue in Wild Dunes, where they said, hey, we're out of this business. We would like to hand off the control entirely to the city. And at that point, and that's probably now 10, 15 years ago, the city enacted a zoning overlay district that was developed to try to mimic what the beach company had historically, their historic policies. So in that zoning change, it specifically allowed pools to be seaward of the maximum building line. To Cindy's point, I think that was probably done because it's like, well, it's always been accretional, probably never been a problem. The beach company allows it. Why wouldn't we allow it? In hindsight, that probably was not a good policy decision. I think we'd be personally in a better off position if we had not allowed pools to be built seaward of that line. And that's a little bit of a, we've kind of talked internally about, do we try to roll that back knowing now what we do know? Do we somehow change or suggest that we change the zoning regulations to not allow pools out there? And
How many lots are left now, Douglas, that don't have a pool?
not many. I mean, not many, but you do have a lot of
If we know,
redevelopment.
I mean, if we
They're
know what we
moving
know, then
forward,
we
though.
probably ought to address it, I would
But
think.
the in the
I have a
future
question.
idea that, you tell people that, okay, if you have a pool there now, that's fine. But if it's a new construction or a tear down, or it's probably not a good idea. I mean,
Can you flip back to the 2014? Are you, I think I understood this to be what you're saying. So you have that dune in front of these structures, the pools and the homes. And I've never really thought about erosion from the landward side, but are you saying that the further you push, I mean, obviously, if there's a pool there, there's not a dune there, but are you saying that even, like, there are pools there, obviously, and there's a dune in front of it, but are you saying that as you build out these other structures, you're getting erosion from the other side as well?
No, you're not getting erosion, but your allowable erosion from the seaward side reduces before you have problems.
Your
You know,
tolerance before you're in pain gets greatly reduced because now you have this
is
line of
that an
structures.
elevated, is that elevated dune, or is that more
This-
just like shrub?
This one,
like, yeah.
it was a full dune. This was
Like that
before,
line.
yeah, this was before Matthew and Irma
Yeah.
and Joaquin. So this was kind of before, everything started going south the past 7 or 8 years.
Because that looks,
So
from
it's-
this perspective, it just looks like it's like a flat.
Yeah, no, there was some pretty substantial dunes there.
If I understand you correctly, I mean, we basically, foliage and everything has gotten taken away from the landward side. And that's reduced the amount that foliage is there to hold the sand and keep it all in place.
Yeah,
I mean, from that part, and then, like you said, you get closer to the beach. So the buffer is reduced, is what we've done.
Yeah, I mean, most of the vegetation losses from the storm events that have just eroded the dune, but there are some, landscaped areas or pools that have removed some dune vegetation as well. But really, the structure being there now, that if we're trying to maintain a sandy beach in front of a pool or a yard or a fence, you just have to shift everything seaward that you're trying to maintain.
So Stephen, could you not, I guess, back to how your or what cubic yardage of protection you need in front of something, could you not make that like the OCRM setback line? I mean, we know that all of that stuff should stop at the OCRM, the current baseline or setback line, one of the two, choose one of those. And then just have a much smaller, so instead of 450 from a house, we kind of have 70 from the OCRM setback line and manage it that way?
You could. I mean, we can calculate it from any reference point we want to. I think the issue with that is the setback line really doesn't consider where structures are at all. So it may not help you try to protect certain structures. And it also includes an erosion rate that is variable, so, which isn't a bad idea to kind of account for the erosion changes up and down the beach. But it's relative off of where the dune is, which doesn't have any consideration of where the structure
For
are
truly
behind it.
what's kind of an emergent situation if you're protecting against
Yeah,
a,
I mean, I think
line.
from the city's perspective, is y'all's interest is trying to, maintain the beach for public use, but also maintain properties for, property protection. So that's where I think your line needs to say is, how are the properties doing? And how, that will translate to the, dry sand recreational beach as well. But I think it is a significant question on more of a policy side than an engineering side is, is it houses, is it pools?
From
Where do
where?
you want to start?
Yeah. Can we just do a time check real quick? I know this is a great conversation. You want to keep going for just a little bit, or?
I've got a couple of more questions.
Continue it
Um,
with Stephen next
Is that okay?
Friday,
That's
because we know
okay.
he'll be here next week anyway. Oh, you're out, next week,
Yeah.
aren't you?
I think I can.
Spring break?
Do you have some questions otherwise? Yeah, and then I
Yeah.
want to get back to the one I started with.
Let's try.
go ahead
and-
if you wanna.
Yeah, let's try and wrap up at noon if we can, just to be respectful.
Yeah, okay, so, and maybe just laying it out, so the two things that I came to this meeting, given all the time that we've really, like you summed it up, Mayor, it has been incredibly helpful. I see two issues that are at top of my mind, and again, just to share, one of which is the elephant in the room, which is for example, as we talked about groins, and we've talked about the erosion, and we've talked about the sand coming in, we're still today sitting here with a highly eroded beach, newly eroded beach inlet corner, and we don't have a set date when we're going to get sand. We're just not in control of that right now. And we have spring tides coming next week. So that's one issue that's highly on my mind and others is where is the town on that? And then two, and more, very much in tune with where we are in this meeting is I feel very strongly that it's time to start, and this is what we could do the next meeting, but lay out, what do we need to do to get a plan? What companies do we go to? We need bids. We'll need to figure out where those funds come from. We'll need to, as Stephen has quite aptly pointed out, at some point, there needs to be some direction to those individuals. What are we protecting? What aren't we protecting? And what our ultimate restoration is. So I would suggest and highly recommend that we put that on the agenda for next week as, particularly if we don't have a visitor coming in, is moving forward with those next steps. And also, do we need somebody to come in as a part-time employee? Is there funding that we have from the accommodation tax that we can use for that and for this? I have so many questions, but I think that's one I think that I would propose we discuss next week. And then I don't think we have till next week as regards what do we do in this interim? And here we have a week from now, another spring tide coming.
That was my question on.
Okay, and
number
sorry,
one.
so
Yeah.
that
No,
was a
you're
lot
good.
I
Yeah.
spit
So
out.
what do you want the city to do for the next spring tide? I mean, I guess I'm confused with what?
Well, I
mean, nothing's gonna happen
I think what
next
needs
week.
to happen is or what I would ask for is let's have a clear communication as to what people are going to be expecting between now and the next king tide cycle. And also, if we're looking at May or June, I mean, if the Army Corps is going to be wrapping up April 20-ish or so up at Merle's Inlet, is it going to take them a month to deploy, 2 months to deploy, so that the people at beachfront between Breach Inlet and 900 are now all the way down to the pier, what can they expect? Is there going to be any assistance from the city or Collins? And if not, I think we need to communicate very clearly, what can the residents do? I think we've talked about it before. Is it sandbagging? Is it bringing in their own sand? But I think right now there isn't a lot of, I'm not sure people really know. And if we've got multiple high tide cycles coming, I just think we ought to just let people know what to expect or what not to expect from the city and from what they need to do for their own responsibility.
When did we pass the ordinance saying that they could put sandbags out? That was last
It's a while
June.
ago, yeah.
So, I mean, it's been since June that
Truck it in,
that's been,
sandbag
I
it.
mean, listening to the two people from Sullivan's, that's what they do on Sullivan's. And people realize that it's their responsibility. And we passed an emergency ordinance almost a year ago to allow people to put sandbags. And I don't believe, did anyone? I don't believe anyone did.
Nobody's taking advantage of it.
So, I mean, kind of to the mayor's point, I don't, there's only so much that the city can do. And I feel like we've
Yeah.
we've done a lot, and we're fighting against Mother Nature, and, there comes a point where I think the fact that no one's taken advantage of the possibility of sandbags is, I don't know. I don't know what to say about that.
Well, I think part of it is
Well-
they can't get to the beach to put up the barriers, is there some restriction that they can't have heavy equipment on the beach to, put sand down or put the sandbags down? Because there's not enough room in between people's houses the way it is to get a piece of heavy equipment in there that's needed to place sand or sandbags. Is there some restriction on using a beach access or how you guys get on the beach for a citizen to hire a company to do that?
So the sandbags, and I guess the permission for the walls, it has its own challenges, but that all has to be done from up
Property.
on the high side, behind OCRM's. Anything that the city has allowed has been outside of OCRM's jurisdiction, which has been the challenge.
Gotcha.
The state has permitted trucking in sand, and they will permit individual owners to install sandbags or scrape once it's within 20 feet. We haven't met that condition. Kind of in recent months, we have had 3 properties that have been meeting that condition. And we have, after the high tides, we have gone out and addressed those to get them back to 20 feet. But that's kind of the extent of what the city really can do. And to your question, that's our now kind of standard process is as soon as we have these tides, we go take measurements. If somebody gets within 20 feet, that then triggers us to get Collins on site and begin scraping, which is kind of all we can really do. I mean, there's not a lot else that we legally can do.
So just to summarize,
Yeah.
and that's why I'm just asking for the, clear communication. The expectation, I think, I'm not sure what all the residents expect us to do between now and these high tide cycles. And I think we do need an answer as to how many they're going to need to be preparing for before the Army Corps gets here. So I think what I'm hearing is the city will respond if there's a reaction to within 20 feet of a pool with a scraping. There's not going to be any new sand coming in to prepare before any kind of a tide cycle, and that the residents are pretty much on their own for either sandbagging or trucking in sand, and there are permits to allow them to do that now, to truck in sand.
Absolutely. That's been the case for months.
And I'm just reiterating it so everybody's.
Yeah, we're
knows.
losing
think
focus of
this-
what this committee is about. We're not here to take care of today or tomorrow. We're looking to the future. This needs to be a communication we can do out, which I know you guys have been communicating to residents. I mean, we're losing sight of what we're here for, I think, a little bit. Elizabeth, I cut you off earlier. Yeah. You good? So I think next week, I think Cindy, to your point, I think naturally we're getting to putting pencil to paper with all the conversations we've had, and I think next week does yield itself to do that, essentially to start putting some meat to the bone a little bit around strategy or ideas and kind of start boiling down everything we've heard. Then we've got the Army Corps on the 12th that'll be here to have their conversation. So I didn't mean to cut you off either. So if we have a communication coming out from city on what's available, what's residents are allowed to do in the next, well, until the Army Corps project. I mean, is that what I'm hearing?
No, I think it's super important because I am at that 20 feet, for example, and we are at a different situation. And to address what Katie said, there was the ordinance for the wall, so we wouldn't put in sandbags, but the ordinance is not able to be applied. So therefore, there are probably, I'd be surprised if there's been a permit there's been no permits because it's not doable at this moment. So you can see why why we haven't been sitting on our hands is all that I'm saying. So an informational message would be very helpful so that we know what we can do, what triggers what we can do, would be super helpful.
But if we're within 20 feet, I mean, is that new? Because, I mean, y'all are measuring daily.
No,
and
that's
scraping
not
where
new.
we can. Okay. And Stephen, were you going to say something earlier? Sorry, I might have cut you
I
off.
was just say I can reach out to OCRM about answering that question on when a chronic erosion problem may allow for a structure. I'll do that.
That's really helpful, thank you.
Yeah, and I know my last communication with the Army Corps, I hope there's a pre-construction meeting on the 8th is what they were targeting.
I think it's the 10th.
10th. And according to the project manager, the Army Corps, they should have a timeline and a task plan next week before that 10th meeting. So I hope maybe we'll have something next week just to at least have definitive when stuff's going to start flying.
Thank you
That would be
very
helpful.
much. Yes.
I agree with you, because this has been, thought was coming December, and
think it was-
January, February,
I
now
want to say
we're-
August was our first
August, yeah.
timeline. So-
I mean, it's giving you a little insight, you know, what Nicole said it 2 weeks ago about how expensive and slow they are. You know, it's going to be interesting just to hear the Army Corps project, not this project, but the bigger project they're going to come talk to us about. You know, the lack of control is the one thing that I know is going to give us all pause. And then you're fighting for funding at a federal level, not just a state level, which takes it to a interesting spot to me. But again, I'm interested to hear what they have to say. I'm
One
sorry.
quick question on that. Have you dealt with projects like this during the high season on the beach?
Yes, our first one out here was started Memorial Day and ended July 4th, I
right.
think.
Okay, so that's something that y'all are prepared for and,
North Carolina requires it be in the summer, don't they?
because of the waves.
In the Outer
Because too much
Banks, yeah,
weight.
the logistics force it to be, so we've celebrated plenty of 4th of Julys out on a beach watching the dredge work.
And my husband brought up mosquitoes have been a previous problem with some of these.
With
Just an FYI, I don't know where the
Renourishment?
information, consider that all hearsay, but with with the coming,
Dredge materials being
coming
used?
over.
I know
So
it was- it hasn't been the last
I just throw
two.
stuff out that
Yeah.
we may have some unexpected,
It's very good shell hunting.
Yes,
Just-
the
that I'm in for.
giant,
Oh, man.
giant shark's teeth.
I mean,
Awesome.
Now, will
All right.
some of the beach accesses be closed down, or how does that work?
I think they'll have to be.
The way this project will work is they should try to maintain an access along the upper part of the beach for people to walk from one side of the project to the other. They should be able to maintain the accesses for most of the project, but there may be temporary closures for a couple of days as they're moving through a site for a particular access, but it should be pretty open.
So are you here next week or not?
I can be, yeah.
I
I'll
know
be out
you're
Monday
out.
through Wednesday.
No,
Friday.
I'm back.
You're back Friday.
Spring break?
Okay.
Couple of days.
So I think, I don't even know if we can talk about if we need Stephen or not, but I think the next Friday, I don't think we have anybody else scheduled to come in unless y'all want to throw somebody out to bring in, but Army Corps is next. So I think maybe we do start putting some
Are we,
document
are
together.
we putting a pin in the idea of these tax districts? Are we going to hear from somebody about the creation, like the legal challenges
Yeah,
with the
that
creation
is
of
true. That
tax
is on the
districts?
list.
Or,
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know when we want to have that discussion. It may be premature, but.
And do we have, from what Stephen provided today, do we think we have enough to have like our line in the sand?
I think it would be helpful to have Stephen here if you're available, just, you know, if we go down a bunny trail and we're just
Yeah.
interpreting the data wrong,
Yeah.
you'll put us.
Yeah.
Interpreting this wrong,
Yeah,
Scott? What are you talking about?
I know, it's memorized by now, you know?
Yeah, and I can put up a couple of other scenarios on how adjusting that ideal volume will impact, potential quantities.
Yes,
I
I
think
mean,
that'll-
your whole conversation, the 450 feels rich
Yeah.
to me,
Well,
but
I like to start safe and
No, I'm with you.
expensive and then dial it back after that.
look how much we're saving. I see how you work, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and it also, I mean, if this is accretional down there and this is more of a short-term issue, then that 450 becomes more of a reasonable number, right? I mean,
Yeah, what I was talking to Doug earlier about is looking at all of our dates from 2009 is when we started surveying to now and see what was our maximum volume at any one of those dates. And look at, again, a condition in 2014, nobody was concerned about the beach condition along that area from my understanding. So if we kind of pick a condition, say, look, everybody was happy here, so let's use that as our minimum. There's a couple of different ways to approach that may make a little more sense to, the lay people.
Like us.
I guess.
I think you are close to experts.
I'm looking for continuing education.
Certainly know more than ever
We
wanted.
did.
Continuing ed units are going to happen here soon.
Everybody gets a certificate after this thing's over.
Thank you.
All right, Douglas, we good for next week, kind of where we're headed? And Stephen, if do not cut your vacation short. for
Oh, no, it
this.
was already.
all right.
I will not be here.
Okay.
I will not
You're
be
out.
here.
You're out. Yeah, y'all are spring breaking.